Then I had one lecture slide that I used to roll out year after year, first year law, which was all about these snippets of law that we've talked about, what the surveyors need to know, a bit on contract, a bit on negligence, a bit on blah, blah, blah. And whether they wanted to know about it or not, because it was a law class, they got told who were the first women lawyers, because I thought I'd ram this down their throats. Then I was sort of just Googling around and I came across the first woman surveyor.
Welcome to the Surveyor Hub podcast for surveyors who just love what they do. I'm Marion Ellis, and in today's episode, I catch up with Carrie de Silva. Many of you will know Carrie from her work as Honorary Professor at the Royal Agricultural University, a trainer at Sava, the surveying school, her books and writing contributions on negligence, but also her work and research on the first female surveyors. So grab a brew, take the dog for a walk, or jump into the car for your next inspection and listen in. Oh, and don't forget to check out the podcast show notes, which are also available on the Love Surveying website. Welcome to the podcast. It's lovely to chat to you.
And to you, Marion.
And it's been a little while, but I've been trying to get you on the podcast for a little while to have a chat. And I know you're super busy, but also I'm terrible at forgetting what I'm doing and what I'm up to. So it's really good to have you on. And we know each other from our Bluebox Partners days. But could you, for listeners who have no idea who you are, explain a bit more about what you do and take it from there? Because you're not a surveyor, but no, you're very useful to us as surveyors.
That's what I'd start with, really. So I've been teaching prospective chartered surveyors for well over 20 years. My background is as an academic lawyer, and before that in tax law. So I graduated in law a little late. I was a slightly mature student, having sort of been abroad and sort of not really done O&A levels at the right time. Went into office work, did O&A levels in the evening, did a straightforward law degree full time. So I didn't graduate till I was 27. And then I went into the sort of corporate world. Arthur Andersen, what was one of them, the big five, equivalent to PwC for younger listeners, one of those sorts of sort of did taxation and tax law. When I've had children, I'm still in that world, but I morphed into teaching because I morphed into, although I was full on for the first year or two of my son's life, that was all a bit too much. And all you lovely young people that get sort of maternity leave and paternity leave and all the good stuff, you know, 30 years and more ago, it was a slightly different picture, particularly if you were in the professions. Anyway, we've moved some way forward on that. So I morphed into teaching, and then I found myself teaching prospective chartered surveyors over 20 years ago, almost by chance. It was just the advert that wanted a law lecturer that suited me. I apparently suited them. I came more into the residential because I was largely teaching prospective rural surveyors, land agents, at Harper Adams University, actually. And I came into more the rural world really by quite a fluke. Obviously, rural's a funny area because we cover obviously agricultural, but residential and commercial property as well. So it was got quite a little background of the sorts of legal issues they wanted. I actually wrote an article on the history of surveying education. Obviously, being at a university, I'm interested in education. Surveying, literally going back hundreds of years through to when they started accrediting in the 19th century, not only the RICS, but all the other different surveying groups many of which have been absorbed into the RICS over the 20th century. I wrote that article and the article happened to be seen, one of those serendipitous things, by a name that will be familiar to many, if not all listeners, and that was Chris Rispin. And he just happened, right desk on the right day at the right time in front of the right man. He happened to be looking for somebody to help in the new incarnation of the residential surveying course, which is run via Sava. And so I got involved at the beginning there'd been various courses on various things for the sector before, but in 2014 I got involved in that. And there I still am. I mean, it started with, would you be able to manage 2 or 3 days a year? Because it was only more or less one group going through. And we now have significant numbers of groups. And as Marion said, that was initially done through a company which had other strands and predated that by a long way, but it was Bluebox, and they were predominantly, not exclusively, trading providers. And I got in there. So that was my introduction to the residential world, but I'm still very much the law and a little bit, not so much on this course, but with other courses, taxation. And I'm still involved with the rural universities. I sort of dodge between Harper Adams and the Royal Agricultural University. And I'm a professor of real estate practice law with Cirencester. That's the Royal Agricultural University. That's a professor without portfolio, really. I'm a kind of visiting professor, and I still do a bit of visiting lecturing at Harper Adams on the postgraduate prospective rural surveyors that are postgrads. So they've found the lovely world of surveying a little bit later on. And of course, also very much with the residential surveyors through Sava and training solutions, doing bits of CPD and whatever. So that's really where I come from and what I'm doing on the day-to-day stuff, really. My main work.
Oh, there's so many questions. What an amazing, varied career. Because I know do you specialise in equine law?
Well, I don't
as well,
specialise in equine as such.
So that's horses
in
for the non-rural.
Few urbanites. Not that you don't get horses in town. Funny I should say that, because I've just been typing about the various mounted police women, and they were obviously in town. Anyway, bit of a tangent. No, because being very much originally, until Bluebox and Sava discovered me, I was very much in the rural land-based sector. Obviously, horses are something that are around. People are managing land for horse use, selling and valuing property for equine use. So you're sort of living in those circles. And just on a CPD level, not on any accredited level, I've been running equine law seminars, sort of one-day seminars. So either in-house at the university or for anybody that would have me, really. So I've done bits with the British Horse Society, some of the specialist insurance companies that deal with equine and agricultural property, actually the horse welfare organisations. So various people. So where people are dealing with horses, either personally as a hobby, as competitors, or indeed professionally, there's lots of aspects of law that they should be aware of, even if only to know, oh, crikey, this is where I do need to get further advice, nip problems in the bud.
Do you actually like horses?
Yes. 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 No, I've ridden all my life, only in a very small, just recreational.
Yeah. It's interesting. So various questions I want to ask you. You've had this sort of quite varied career, and you just explained, taxation, equine law, rural, residential. How, and perhaps it's sort of different in law, but I sort of see similar with surveyors where they get involved in different types of work. How do you, say, jump about or evolve? How do you know you're ready to talk about equine law? How do you know you're ready to talk about different things? Is it qualifications or?
Equine law has been a misnomer. I told the same thing to everybody. So if you look at the areas of law that people running an equine business need to know, a residential surveyor needs to know, obviously there are bits I draw out, but we talk about, negligence. Well, the framework's the same. When I've got a room full of residential surveyors, I might be specialising and drawing on examples of our lovely negligent valuation, of which I've written a whole little case book. There are so many cases, but that's nothing against valuers, because any subject you pick, you could do that. So, the frameworks of contract law, the frameworks of negligence, hires liability, maybe some employment law, all the different things that people need to know in these sectors are similar. And also then getting towards more specialism, it's all pretty much, I would say, the land and property sector.
Yeah.
So yes, I've got little bits of areas where I've delved deeper that I wouldn't say, with the rural people that I wouldn't if I wasn't dealing with rural or obviously residential. I particularly, I mean, it's not to keep dwelling on the valuation, but I picked that up more than I had done before when starting to work with the residential surveyors. But the key, if you list the subject areas, yes, there are some special bits. So, I mean, there's a load of stuff on the Animals Act that clearly I don't do with the surveyors or with the residential. It's actually kind of interesting, though, because it is all land and property. The rooms full of resi valuers that I've been teaching through Bluebox and Sava, there's always somebody in the room that has other interests, and those other interests and experience might be more commercial property. It might be more in planning and development. And it's surprisingly often some of them you find so.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see this with a lot of surveyors that I come across is, you might start on a commercial or rural path, but then your career takes you into residential and the market changes and you move back to something else. And so how surveyors define themselves or what they call themselves can really evolve over the course of a career.
It's interesting you should say that, Marion. And I mean, that's what's kind of interesting about the qualification, because it gives you this scope, because you don't do a separate qualification. You might need separate short courses to give you particular technical information. But once you're a surveyor, or an ASOC, or RICS, or whatever it might be. And I know you qualify through specific routes, but the actual qualification, you don't have to qualify as a chartered surveyor again. When we had it, but it was particularly outstanding when the last big recession, the sort of 2008 period. And on our postgraduate course at the university, we got, I mean, I won't say a waterfall, but certainly a trickle, quite a few over a few years of commercial surveyors. Suddenly their world had fallen apart and they were requalifying. So they were already chartered surveyors, but they were doing a small number of modules, saying, actually, we're really interested in the rural side and we'll do that. And as you say, things change with the markets, the economic cycle, people's personal interests. Yeah.
And like anything, you've got to make sure you've got the technical ability to do whatever it is. That's the starting point. Many surveyors will have heard you speak at different events or attending your training where you talked about negligence and all the different cases. One of the things I've often found confusing is understanding case law. And sometimes something that happens in one part of the law sets a precedent for something that happens in a different sector. And some cases are brought because of one particular reason, but it has implications for others. It's quite hard to keep track unless you're really interested and have the mind like yourself. But with a lot of, so that really is a point for anybody out there who gets bamboozled. With all the different ones you think you need to remember, you're not alone. But what do you think surveyors could be doing? On the one hand, yes, it's be as technically competent as you can be and CPD and those things. But do you think surveyors need to have a better understanding of law? Is there anything in particular you think that they should be doing? Or because you train and learn and get qualified and you might know a bit of law and then people forget it. And for me, it feels like something to keep plugged in regularly, not just the latest hot and large case or whatever comes up, but having a good understanding, because a lot of it's about context.
Yeah.
And we can very easily panic about the next case or the next case that comes. But we've got to look at the picture as a whole and understand the landscape of the world we're working in.
Well, I think you raised quite a few points.
Sorry.
I mean, one, case law is kind of difficult to understand quite how it operates until you're a bit more immersed in it, really, because people learn case law, and I hope I try and get this over in my own classes, but you sort of learn, there's some laws from legislation and some laws from cases, but cases are not just an alternative to legislation. They operate completely differently. And I do find sometimes, not just surveyors, I mean, just people treat cases as if they're legislation. Oh, the law is that the margin on ordinary property is 5%. Well, that's a guide that was in a case. You can find other cases. It's likely to be followed because you can find cases similar, but there's always room for it to be distinguished. There's always room for it to be altered and what have you. It's not like a bit of legislation that sets section 1, 5%. That's it, full stop.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of way it operates is something. Keeping on top of case law, yeah, I mean, you could go mad because there's always things, certainly at the lower levels, and you hope if you read your press in whatever sector you're in, you pick up the main ones. I mean, you mentioned Art and Large, which I think the whole residential sector pretty much knows about, not least because it went to the Court of Appeal, but largely because a couple of almost unrelated to the negligence. I mean, it would have been a straightforward negligence case had the damages not been decided in a slightly unusual way. And of course, had Mr. Large been fully insured, it would have just got dealt with and we wouldn't have really heard all about it. So that's as much a lesson for the surveyors as the negligence. In terms of keeping on top of the cases, yes, you want to keep on top of the main cases. But I think what you also said was very important, Marion, it's the framework. And I think that perhaps does need reminders, and that's what CPD's about. You know, you're not going to go and redo your course on basic tort law every year. It's not necessary. But actually keeping in mind that overall framework of not what is negligence as much as thousands of cases. What the new cases do, of course, is put things in a very practical context. So as well as the actual detailed legal reasoning, I'm sorry to harp on about Art and Large, but it's fairly recent and it's one people will know. It just reminds you, well, what were the practical things that caught the surveyor out? A very experienced surveyor, an surveyor that had no real problems before. Nobody was saying, as is sometimes said in these negligence cases, this is clearly somebody who's incompetent and shouldn't be in practice. Nobody was saying that about Mr. Large. But there were little alarm bells, queries that the clients had raised that he didn't follow up on, things that looked shoddy. Just those practicalities of how you go about your work. I think you can get really useful lessons from the cases from that, because they are, by definition, a particular scenario. You know, this is somebody that went out, they've now been found negligent. Well, what did they do? Almost getting away from the, oh, well, you've got to establish a duty of care, breach of duty of care, the legal framework, which I think, yeah, people do need a periodic reminder of that. But I think they're useful for practitioners, for the sort of stories behind them and what you can do to.
This is so true. And I talk to a lot of my clients and surveyors about, and just like I said, you know, you can be very technically competent, but it's, you know, how you apply it. But also it's the whole service that you're offering people, you know, even your upfront marketing, setting expectation, the sales conversations you have, the way that you interact with people. There are lots of different things that can help you spot a risk, you know, a risk of something going wrong at the earliest opportunity if you're looking for it. And it should be, you know, I've delivered my service to my client. Have they got everything that they need to know to make an informed decision? Because if a client is not asking you questions, if they're not querying things, if you haven't built that in, you're more likely to have a problem. And so that whole customer journey, however fluffy people think it might be, you know, is vitally important. As you were talking there a bit there about big cases, I remember at Bluebox we had a CPD day that we did, and we did a little quiz, like a case law quiz. I don't know if you remember. And we had some cases and you found the locations. And we had some pictures of the locations.
Well, it wasn't me.
Was it?
No, the pictures
wasn't.
wasn't.
Oh, no, it was Phil as well, wasn't it? Phil,
yeah, I did. Yeah, you did.
And it's the whole sort of story around it. And some of those stories are great. There was one, I think you had shared a picture to do with a slug in the beer bottle, was it? Or the ice cream?
Well, yes. I mean, the story of that, of course, and many listeners will be immediately on that, because if you've only done law for about 5 minutes, it's one of those core cases. The foundation of not the foundation of negligence, which is sometimes wrongly said, which irritates me. Because if I might say, when I was writing something on negligence a few years ago, and I really went into it for a journal paper, I found cases dated in the 1300s.
Wow.
similar principles. But Donahue and Stevenson, 1932, House of Lords, was involved a snail in a bottle of ginger beer, crown cap, so the cafe serving it had no interference with it. And it was sort of the basis of modern consumer law, and just exactly you owe a duty of care to. But it just adds that bit of colour to it, knowing the story. And that draws on the point that you said. You got this random case. Physically, it took place in Paisley in Scotland in the 1920s. It's about, cafe serving ginger beer. And yet that is the basis for who you owe duty of care to in wider contexts.
It was quite, well, the stories, they're the stories that bring it to life, because we'll remember the story about the slug. Not necessarily the case name, but even so, we remember it. And I think also I remember with that quiz that we did, so we had pictures of like the location or the house, and it was link it to the actual case law. And we had one, and off the top of my head, I can't remember which case it is, but it's probably good that I don't mention it, because we put in the photo and we emailed it out to people, and then the person, surveyor who was involved, we had the wrong house because Google.
It's Robertson Smith Hampson, 1988, and the surveyor who had been found negligent was still, nearly 30 years later, working for the same firm. And he very kindly told us we got the wrong house, and he even more kindly sent us a picture of the right house, which is, I've brought that one up before.
Oh, yeah, that was hilarious. You think you know everything, and then Google Street View gives you a problem. Yeah.
Something you said about the, obviously knowing these cases, and when you're sitting at your desk or working with your client, where is the exposure and all that. It also leads to something a bit relates to what we were talking about with the equine law bits and bobs that I do. Because sometimes, certainly students and even qualified surveyors sort of, dare I say, glaze over a bit when it gets a bit more, oh, well, do we really need this? Isn't this what the lawyers do? I can't understand these difficult words and all that. And also the other point you made, surveyors and valuers are dealing with loads of different subjects. You can't possibly be absolutely on top of all the planning law and all the law in this area and that area. But I see the role of law. Some of it is core. You need to know how not to be found negligent. But a lot of the wider law that we teach, some of the land law, restrictive covenants, easements, and all this, it's almost so that you concede the questions with your client. You're saying, make sure you don't buy this property until you've checked that out. This is the question to ask your lawyer. And I mean, heart and large again. That was one of the things that came up in there, where there were things that I can't know what Mr. Large was thinking of, but one suspects it was that's a sort of law thing. When he was asked, had he told the client about professional consultant certificates, which give the builders and architects guarantees. And, you think, oh, well, that's the lawyery stuff. And the lawyer, by the same token, I think had thought, oh, well, if there's a problem with the property, the surveyor will pick it up. And there were various things that neither did. And the lawyers were just as negligent as the surveyors in that case, I hasten to add. And as were the architects, as were the builders.
And it's a great, way of looking at it, because actually we all need to be working together holistically for the client and not in silo as much as we are. Carrie, I wanted to ask you about the work that you do, a bit about your writing and the work that you do in terms of empowering or championing women. And as you were talking about your career so far, even though I consider you to be super posh compared to me, you talked about taking some time out and being a mature student, which lots of people can relate to. Your career evolving, with having children and moving into different type of work. So I think no matter how different we might feel, many of us have a similar journey or things that resonate. Tell me a bit about your works. I know you've written some books on first women, and you're involved in all sorts of women-related things, I can put it that way.
Well, I am. Well, what happened, again, this sort of snowballed, really. First of all, I'm also very interested in history as well as law. And I did a master's degree in history part-time, sort of evening classes at the local university, which was Kiel. And so I've always been interested in history and all that. And then I did an abandoned PhD on the history of agricultural education. The PhD didn't get completed, but there's an online ebook and a book that sort of came out of it. Then I had one lecture slide that I used to roll out year after year after year, first year law, which was all about these snippets of law that we've talked about. What do surveyors need to know? Bit on contract, bit on negligence, bit on blah, blah, blah. And whether they wanted to know about it or not, because it was a law class, they got told who were the first women lawyers, because I thought I'd ram this down their throats. So, the first woman solicitor, barrister, judge, Supreme Court. Well, when I first started, we hadn't got it was so long ago, we hadn't got a woman in the Supreme Court. But anyway, there we are. Then that, of course, I was sort of just Googling around, and that's how I came across the first woman surveyor. An awful lot has been done on the first women lawyers, particularly in the last few years. The centenary of women qualifying in most professions was 1922/23. There was a bit of legislation in 1919 that allowed women to enter the professions. Medicine aside, because medicine they'd been in since the 19th century, but women were actually prohibited from being lawyers until then. We're not sure about surveyors. There's no record of anybody applying. They could have applied, things get lost, we don't know. But anyway, once the Act was through, we got a first woman surveyor. So then I sort of did this list, which has now hundreds of names. It's not a book, it's online, it's an e-thing, but it's as I say, there's hundreds of names of women firsts. And a lot of them are in the professions and legal positions and what have you, but also in, just out of sheer interest and whatever. So, the first woman to sell 1 million records or, just random things, sporting achievements, organizations, various things. So that was that one. And then that led me to a bit more deeper work on the first woman surveyor, particularly because she hadn't been done much. Done, that's an awful word, isn't it? She hadn't really been studied so much. Now, the exciting thing about the first woman surveyor, well, there are several exciting things, if I can lead on to this point at this juncture, Marion. Firstly, she wasn't just a surveyor, and I use that word just, not to do any offence to any surveyors, but my goodness, she qualified in 19...
and just for those listening, it's Irene Barclay.
Irene. It's actually Irene, it's pronounced.
Okay.
Barclay. I only knew that recently, Marion, because you've heard me call her Irene.
Well, I've got an Auntie Irene, you see, that's why.
Yeah, I know.
Now we know, okay.
I've since met family members, actually, and other people that knew her. But anyway, she qualified as a chartered surveyor, but she did government commissions. She was doing radio broadcasts. She was working at national level, and she was running private practice. Her sector was housing. So actually in her sector as such, she wasn't groundbreaking, because there'd been women in housing management from the 19th century, sometimes called the Octavia Hill system. Octavia Hill, now better known for being a co-founder of the National Trust. Anyway, she came through that women housing management system, but very few went on to qualify as chartered surveyors. She'd got a degree. She studied history at the University of London, Bedford College, the Women's College. And so there we are. What was I going to say? Oh, yes. She was in private practice. She was also what is now called, what used to be the St Pancras Housing Association. Oh, it's now called Origin Housing. And it wasn't the first, but it was one of the early housing associations. She was involved in slum clearance. She refurbished, first of all, but found that was just a dreadful job. She preferred to demolish and rebuild. And we're talking in the area to the side of Euston Station, Somerstown. And there's a little museum now, Somerstown, covering wider history, but also Irene Barclay and the others. Nobody ever remembers the second woman to qualify. And I wish I hadn't said that, because I've forgotten many.
Evelyn Perry.
And I
recently found a great quiz.
I recently found a picture of Evelyn Perry, because
fabulous.
It doesn't just come up on Google like it does for Irene Barclay. And I found a picture in some of the old St Pancras minutes and magazines. So there we are. And she was secretary of the Pancras Housing Association from 1925 to 1972.
Wow, good grief.
He was in business for over 50 years and had 2 children, a husband who was politically active, and yeah, very interesting person.
There's a couple of things there. Firstly, thank you for sharing that, because I know lots of surveyors out there might not know about Irene Barclay or Evelyn Perry. So there's a couple of things that come to mind, and some of this may not be for you to answer. But I've, for a long time, for lots of different reasons, RICS doesn't seem to have talked about women. You know, you talked about all the other professions, or sort of showcasing role models, if I can put it that way. And what we don't know is whether Irene wanted to do that or not to do that, whether she was involved in championing women or she just wanted to get on with doing
She
her
was
job.
involved in championing women. I'm not sure through the RICS or not. I have no way, but in general she was. And there's actually, I've got letters that she wrote, for instance, to her old college principal, that, you know, she was disappointed that she couldn't, because she had women working for her, both in private practice and the, you know, the housing association. And she actually expressed disappointment that more wouldn't get, they qualified as housing managers, but they wouldn't go to the next stage, which, by the way, at one stage was through the RICS. I mean, the Institute of Housing Management, as I'm sure you know, that's an institute in itself. But at one point, they got these housing managers qualifying through the RICS or the SI. It wasn't Royal in the early 30s yet. And she was disappointed, and she did try. She also was quite keen. I mean, on the one hand, she wanted to champion women, and we've got evidence of that. On the other hand, she was very keen on not being called a woman surveyor. And she said, she did an awful lot of work, particularly post-war, on boards. I mean, things like the gas board and things, sort of senior board role. And she kept saying, I hope I've not been chosen as the token woman, although I suspect I have. You know, she said, I want to be chosen as me, as a surveyor, not as a woman surveyor. So.
And, you know, doesn't that resonate? And I'm sure many women listening to this, it'll absolutely resonate, because even myself, the experience that I've got with surveyors and claims and complaints, and all I ever get asked to do is to be on a D&I panel, talk about women. And I'm, you know, whilst I'm known for the Love Surveying and the Surveyor Hub, I'm largely known for Women in Surveying, which is a small little project I did about, 5 years ago. And I just think it's quite sad. On the one, and, I mean, how long ago was Irene talking about this? And yet we're still not owning the fact that we are women and we're allowed to be women, and what we bring and some of the challenges or positives that we face. And I think it's a really difficult, and there's no silver bullet or solution. We just have to accept where we are, in that on the one hand, I often hear people talking about drawing a line to the past. We've got to move forward with diversity, equity, inclusion. But so many women, their experiences have been, you even not so long ago, you didn't have maternity rights. A lot of women weren't allowed to work after they had their children. You got the whole later life menopause thing where women sort of drop off the scale. And even the most recent data that I've seen on professional membership of RICS is the average membership for a man is something like 29 years, and for a woman it's 16. We have to look at why that is. And
that's an interesting stat. I haven't heard that.
And it's, there will be lots of reasons for that. We just need to keep on talking about it so that we don't forget, and so that we can improve and move forward. And it is a divisive subject. I've been told, I'm excluding other people, and they can choose to feel that way. Because I support women, I have a small women-only group, and I'm not excluding them. I'm just saying sometimes we need to speak out as a woman and the experiences that we have, and other people can do the same. These are just some of the things that I see. So it's interesting to see that even back then, Irene Barclay was talking about the same thing, which is disappointing, I think, in terms of, we think we progress, but have we really?
And of course, surveying is a funny one, isn't it? I can't quote you the latest stats, but when I was sort of doing some of this work. So the latest stats I'd got are probably 2019, 20, and I think it was 17, 17,
Do you know, I
17%
think,
women. And that,
yeah,
no, I mean, law is more than 50% women at intake. Medicine is more than 50% women at intake. I know it's a triangle. I mean, veterinary science is something like 80% female. There's no other of the big professions, I think. I mean, engineering, of course, is yeah, but certainly finance, law, medicine, if you look at the professions, none of them are so low. I know it is improving.
yes, and I think that's the thing. I hear, anything between 14% and 19%, but
So yeah, so similar.
it's all about the data.
Mm.
If they've got the data, if people are declaring their gender, which obviously people don't have to do. But also, I think, what's encouraging, and I've seen this, that some people have said is 35% or 40% of new recruits are female, which is great. But then you think on the other end of the scale, how do we stop them disappearing? And also, I think that's in part not just the whole challenges or not and opportunities that women face, but also as our careers develop, very often we come away from the technical side of doing the job to more management or training or supportive type roles. And, what is a surveyor anymore when multiple disciplines do multiple different things with under one professional membership? And I went through that with my own journey with that when I became a fellow. It was almost am I a real surveyor anymore? Marion, and it's how we all define it and move forwards.
What I'm quite interested in is looking at where you talk about obviously intake has improved, and that's the case. And I mentioned other professions where it's much higher proportion of women, but it's still a triangle. There's far fewer women as you go up, 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 up. Obviously, there's fewer of everybody, but proportionately more men. I mean, and I think that's for several reasons, some of which impact men as well and are not particularly healthy. Because there's been overt discrimination, and yes, a woman goes, the interview panel don't think they're suitable, or how are they going to manage the children, all that nonsense. I think maybe I'm naive that much of that has gone. But I think there are 2 or 3 reasons why either women are not even putting themselves forward. And this is a really interesting one. I went to a sort of senior academic event where there were talks from VCs and things, who are relatively low percentage of women are vice chancellors or even professors. And women aren't applying. It's that old chestnut. If it says you need 10 skills and you've got 9 of them, I don't qualify for that job. Whereas a man will give it a go. There is a lot of truth in that. I know it's been hackneyed. So they're not presenting. I'm actually looking at some other things. Well, why aren't they presenting? Is it messages they've got from, work, or are there subliminal things? I mean, a lot of people have done this, research on public, commemoration of women in public spaces. This sounds a bit left field, but, a tiny percentage of public statues are women compared to men. As you know, I'll be honest, largely just because it's personally interesting, because I like finding about the biographies of the women, but also the serious point of women being visible in public spaces. As you'll know, I'm doing a Women in Street Names project, where I'm looking at streets named after women.
Streets, not street corners.
Just streets named after women. So the bit I really enjoy doing just for pleasure is finding Florence Nightingale Street or something. We all know who Florence Nightingale is, but there's lots of streets named after maybe women who were locally known, not nationally, or women who it was named, 100 years ago, we've forgotten who she is. So I like delving into biographies. But again, huge mismatch in proportion gender-wise, and that sort of public visibility. So women are not putting themselves forward for jobs for whichever reason. The other one is they're not putting forward for jobs because they don't want what senior roles bring. Whether that's senior political roles and you get all this online rubbish, or other roles. Many other roles get a lot of online inappropriateness these days, or the working hours. And
Yeah.
those things are inappropriate for men. Men are dealing with that. I mean, quite
I,
famously, Britain is always quoted as having the longest working hours and the lowest productivity, and certainly if you look at Scandinavian countries, I mean, this is very broad brush statement and, sure could be picked holes in, but they do seem to have a better balance, and women and men, you know, are not expected to be all hours. I mean, the reason I told you I morphed into education, really, you're still in the meeting at 10 o'clock at night, and that's pretty common.
yeah.
But those sort of, city firm type firms, nobody should be doing that.
I think you're
But
absolutely
it's
right.
disproportionately the
Yeah.
women that opt out of it and say, I just can't take that role, even though I may well get it, because I don't want the whole what goes with that. And we should be re-looking at work in general, not only for women. And then
I absolutely agree. And I think COVID has had we'll see the potential to really level and address some of that. I know certainly, some men I know work in a very toxic masculine culture where you've got to be in early and you do stay late because that's the macho or the thing to do. But then with being at home, I know certainly my husband has seen more of my daughter than my son, through lockdown, when he was a similar age, but also it being much more acceptable to be yourself and be the dad or to be the parent at work. I mean, I remember being on a call at 7 o'clock at night, and I'd had to put my son was little, and I had to put him in front of some Power Rangers TV programs that he liked at the time. And I remember saying that on the call, and it was literally like tumbleweed. Marion's talking about her kids again or whatever. Whereas, now you see, when I think about the things my daughter got up to as my husband's on a professional, work Zoom call, and she comes in and puts, things on his head and all sorts, it's normalizing those things for parents and everybody.
and I think some high profile, I mean,
Yeah.
it was done as a light-hearted way, at the end of the news and things, there were quite a few very high profile people.
And there was
Had
that,
those sort of Zoom pictures of,
yeah.
some minister or something, and the
There was
same
that
sort of
there was that interview. I'll see if I can put a link into it of the guy being interviewed, and then the little kid comes running through. I'll put a link to it. That was quite funny. I find it funny because the little girl's name was Marion. It turned out, but I think you're right. And this is where all of us can be an ally for each other to normalize, because you're right. We can't be our best if we're working those kind of hours, and it's all about breaking a pattern of culture. I think visibility, absolutely. And we often talk about, female role models. And I saw a post on LinkedIn just the other day, and it had a picture of the RICS presidents, past and future, all women. And it said something like, yes, we've cracked it. I just thought, until my surveyor on a wet Tuesday in Margate feels included, no, we haven't. It's a start, absolutely, but it's by no way means fixed. And in terms of visibility, no one, I think there's a couple of things. No one has shown women how, in terms of confidence, opportunity earlier in your career. And then, as you get older, you've got different things that happen. Just like when you come back from maternity leave and you think about the first day, well, I remember my computer password and remember what I do, as a job. We're not often supported in how to be visible. And the reason for that, and some of us do feel there's a tokenism there. I mean, I remember the first time I had to stand up at a conference and speak to 600 surveyors. Nobody showed me how or gave me support or training to do that. And yet it was, okay, Marion will do it, And so sometimes it's a
I
big
guess
ask.
that,
I think we've got
I
to
mean,
nurture
that might have been
people
the
too.
same. I mean, that particular example might have been the same.
And it could,
in a young man in the
yeah, and it absolutely could be. But this is also why we need to support people,
oh,
and we also need to take responsibility for it, to not just concentrate on the technical side of our job, but also look at the, what awful description, the softer skills,
yes.
in terms of our confidence and being visible and, putting ourselves out there and asking for the opportunities. Yeah, and believe that we can do it.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with the last sentence. I think I'm a bit, oh, I shouldn't say this in the middle of a podcast, probably. I think I don't say less tolerant than you. Tolerant's probably the wrong word. I mean, I do kind of think work your way through or just do it in some instances. But I also, on the other side of that coin, yes, I think the role models and I think the good working practices that, I mean, some of the things you've mentioned would be for all people. I think what there is, and I do believe this, there is an intrinsic difference. And some, Margaret Thatcher didn't need anybody to show her because she's just that sort of person. It's, that's, some women just get through, as it were. But I think as a generality, there is that difference in like the women not putting themselves forward because they don't think they qualify. There will be other men who don't tick all 10 boxes, they only tick 9. But in general, the men are more likely to say, well, I tick most of them, I will try for that interview. Whereas in general, the women are likely to say, oh, I'm not ready for that yet because I only tick 9 3/4 of the boxes. So I think that's where the differences are.
And I think that comes back to support through your career, and helping you feel confident. And there's nothing worse, I think, or frustrating when you have a role model out there who's clearly has 4 hours sleep a night and will go off and run the country and sits there and says, well, I've got imposter syndrome. And it's just, and they may well have, but it's not relatable. And you want to see the journey of how they actually got there. I don't know if you read, there's a really interesting Harvard Business Review report called Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome.
Oh, no, I haven't. I'm going to
there you go.
down. Yeah.
One for you. I'll put the link in the show notes. And it's interesting because it explains the background to imposter syndrome and how that came about. But it also talks about actually people don't feel welcome and included, and therefore you always feel like the odd one out. And that can happen. I mean, I see it a lot for men. I see it a lot with surveyors in terms of their technical ability and how qualified somebody is. I see it certainly on a neurodiversity front. But there are practical things, for, if someone's not considered, on a building site, how you're going to use the loo or shoved all the, the storage materials in there. It's the little things that can make someone feel welcome and included. And all of those things in a row to make you feel, well, I'm not good enough to be here.
And I think that that's what led me on to, as I say, the street names, which, okay, is half just interesting, but there is a serious point about this that we don't have examples. And it was at this conference I went to some years ago where there were vice chancellors, very senior women saying that, they should have applied earlier or they know that women aren't. And that was, maybe I'm not the best to speak to this about. Because it hasn't been a big thing for me. I have worked in a lot of all-male environments and I just sort of plow on and, I'm not terribly diffident, as I think you probably know, Marion. But it was surprising to me, and I know a lot of women are like that, but what surprised me was very senior women. Very senior women saying this had been an issue and they didn't apply for things, or women just below professor, just below VC saying, oh, they're not applying because. And then I really did start to see, well, there is a gender, and I read more about this. And that's the sort of thing that I'm looking at, these messages, not just the street names and the statues, but as you say, other things in the workplace that can be done to give that support and the right message that people can, if they want. The other part of the point is I'm quite keen on getting the message out because I think there's too much, going back, and I'm quite a bit older than you, people got a job and they were in it and it was fine. There's almost people are feeling guilty and, they're not ambitious enough or they haven't until they go to the next stage, which might be more pressure than they want. There are other things in life and actually not applying. If you're not applying because you've got imposter syndrome and you don't think you're ready for it and all that, well, that's
you just don't want to.
But if you just don't want it, actually, I do want to, get home earlier or work part-time, that work for that job. And I think that is quite an issue nowadays, that people feel they've got to go other than some sort of failure. I know some of these are wider issues and money, that goes with the bigger job and and the whole picture of life. But I do think there's more pressure on that people feel now, which I think we need to get away with. There is more to life than just work.
Absolutely.
Paid employment.
Absolutely, Kerry. And it's all about how we define success.
Yeah.
Have you been qualified the longest? Do you have the biggest business? Do you earn the most money? Whereas, we'd all like to be healthy, quite frankly. We'd like to see our friends and family and kids. And I think this is where understanding your values, what's important to you, is really key, because that gives you that grounding. And so that you don't have to run for president or whatever it is you're encouraged to do, and you can be happy and confident with it. And for those, then looking at saying, well, how do we get women through the pipeline? Or forcing us, square peg into a round hole. No, I wouldn't want to work all those hours and not see my kids, no matter how much support I had at home, with an ironing lady and a cleaner and whatever. I just don't want to do it. And therefore, it all needs to change. But I absolutely see it has to change for men too.
No, I mean, a very concrete example. I told you I was heavily involved with rural practice courses for many years, still am. The number of the entry requirements are moderate, A-level wise. You need some good A-levels, but you don't need 3 A's, let's be honest. The number of students, we didn't get many, but every year there were students with 3 A's at A-level, even A stars, who were told their schools had really tried to put them off.
Yes.
Oh, with 3 A's, you could go and do law or something. Law? All these schools think doing law is a success. The number of law graduates that get training contracts is through the floor. Then they're in jobs that they don't like, because actually a lot of the law students don't like law. They're not doing it because they're interested in it. Schools and parents think it's a good job, in inverted commas, and it's lucrative if you go into the right branch. Not all law is lucrative. And we only saw the ones that got through all that, but said, no, I want to be a land agent because I know about that as a profession. It's this lifestyle I want. And the days when land agents, tuppence halfpenny for the lifestyle are gone. They actually can turn, they're not like the commercial guys and gals, but they certainly turn a perfectly reasonable living. And I thought, well, how many really good people are the schools putting off? Because they think these other careers are so-called, better.
And that's it, isn't it? It's great.
And surveying in general, I would add to that. Obviously, I saw the role. I think surveying in general, if they were coming with their A stars and A's at A level, schools would be directing them into law and finance. And they might be fine, but they may neither, they may not be as happy. It may not be what they want. So I think that's something surveying in general needs to get over.
And as we're recording this today, my kids are actually off because their school's on strike. I think that's a really important point, Carrie. And I think I was at Anne Gray's, the new president's inauguration event a couple of days ago as we record this. And she, in her speech, she talked about how I can't remember what the stat was, something like 80 or 90% of Gen Z, wants better quality life, work, meaningful work. And can you imagine if someone with that high caliber 3 A stars went into nursing or social care or surveying, and the difference they can make at that, what we're looking at the moment seem to be not as great jobs, it's
they can make a difference to the whole profession, and they can really shine themselves. Whereas actually, if they go into law, there's no guarantees, and it's, there's loads of other people because they're all. It's just, I think there's a lot of ignorance. The career. I mean, we've talked about this just off podcast, over these last years, haven't we? The recruitment of people into surveying, and I think that's certainly the scope, and there are jobs there. I mean, all these other things that the schools think are great careers, there aren't the jobs there.
And this is why we need to really be visible, show the kind of work we do, the difference that it makes. I know RICS and others, I did a webinar recently on, again, I'll put a link to the show notes. They're good show notes, these, on getting into schools and understanding what's available. But if we don't talk about it, but also with meaning, who would really want to work? If you tell the truth, how much you actually earn, the hours you put in, how miserable things are, how on earth does that inspire anyone? And so that's why I think we should talk about love surveying. Why we love what we do. Oh, Carrie, thanks ever so much for your time today. That's been a really interesting conversation, and I'm sure people will get a lot from that.
Thank you, Marion.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Don't forget, you can find the links and notes in the show notes or on the Love Surveying website, where you can also find the webinars for the Hub sessions and also take a sneaky peek at the Surveyor Hub directory.